So, my name is Dandelion. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm here to talk to you about SourceCred. Now, SourceCred is actually a lot of different things. It's a social algorithm. It's a cryptoeconomic system. It is a bold cred experiment in making open source sustainable. And to explain what it is, I'm first going to explain how it started. So one day back in January of 2018, I was hanging out with my friend Juan, who is the CEO of Protocol Labs. And we were talking about this problem that he has. So Protocol Labs sponsors a lot of different open source projects, such as IPFS, such as libp2p. And then in turn, they depend on the whole rest of the open source ecosystem. So projects like Go. And at the same time, Protocol Labs is creating cryptocurrencies. So Juan had this question, why can't we use the cryptocurrencies we're making to pay everyone in the open source ecosystem? It would both be the right thing to do because all of these open source contributors who are helping make value creation possible deserve some share of the reward. And it would also be a good business move for Protocol Labs because it would really help the projects that they need to sustain and thrive. So we got to thinking about how you could distribute tokens across all of these open source projects. And we thought, okay, maybe you could use objective metrics. Maybe you could have a certain amount of tokens per commit or per line of code. And the problem here is that these are all basically counters. You're counting the number of different kinds of activity. And counters are really easy to game because it's hard to tell just knowing something is a pull request. Is it fixing a typo? Is it creating a vital feature? Since you can't answer that question, you can't pay a fixed rate. So then we thought about the subjective ideas. What if contributors are reviewing each other? Or what if you kind of have a 5-star system and you're rating every contribution? And here you run into problems where it tends to be biased and it doesn't scale very well once the community goes above Dunbar's number. So if you've got a community with thousands of contributors, how are you going to know who each of these people are to review them without creating an unacceptable degree of centralization and hierarchy? So it kind of seemed that we need a middle approach. Something that would both start from objective data, but then be able to incorporate subjective context. We needed a social algorithm. So that brings us to the genesis of SourceCred. Basically, there's this really neat algorithm that's fascinated me for many years called PageRank. PageRank is named both for ranking web pages and after Larry Page, the founder of Google, because PageRank was actually the starting point for Google itself. Back in '98, Larry Page and Sergey Brin were students at Stanford, and they came up with this algorithm for scoring websites. And the basic idea is quite simple. The idea is that you give every website a score based on the score of the websites that linked to it. So you're not just counting the inbound edges, the inbound links, because that'd be too easy to game with a whole slew of spam websites, but rather you're counting links from websites that themselves had a lot of inbound interest. And what we can see in this diagram is that it kind of gets a little bit of Sybil resistance because we can imagine that these teal nodes on the bottom are all spam websites and they're all linking to the node E. So in a naive algorithm, this would give E the most score because it has so many inbound links. But because nobody is linking to the possibly Sybil nodes, it contributes very little score to E. Now, people have used PageRank obviously for ranking web pages. And they've also done a lot of research on using PageRank to rank people and to create trust graphs between individuals. The idea of SourceCred is what if we used PageRank to look at the relationships between contributions? So here's an example graph in which we have got a lot of different kinds of work, a lot of different kinds of contributions that have come together to make a feature. So on the one hand, feature needs to be inspired. People need to propose a feature. People need to come up with this. And so we've got an in-person chat that contributes to a forum post that contributes to the feature. And then on the other hand, launching this feature is going to require engineering work. So we've got pull requests, we've got reviews, and then we've got the contributors who did that work. And now we can run PageRank on this graph, which is to say, we can say that we care about this feature. We know that the community values it. So we're going to flow cred back across this graph so that all the different kinds of work get rewarded. And what's nice about this is that it does start with a lot of objective data because we can import from GitHub or import from the forums all of these posts, all of these pull requests. But it incorporates the subjectivity of knowing, okay, this pull request is one that really mattered because it enabled the features. Or contrapositively, this pull request was one that was never really referenced or depended on again. So it starts with objective data, but then it leverages community curation. And this makes the algorithm start to be intersubjective. And what that means is that it's existing in the interplay between objective reality and our collective perception and our interpretation of that. And if you've read Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, you'll learn that the ability of humans to create intersubjective constructs, intersubjective systems, is really what gives us our ability to coordinate. So let's talk a bit about the properties of these scores, the property of cred. So the first thing to know is cred is community specific. Every project, every community, every group is going to have their own independent instance of cred. It's not like some global reputation network, and indeed it can't be for reasons we'll get into. Cred retroactively updates. This is huge. It means that if you make a contribution that doesn't really get appreciated, maybe you write a critical refactor, maybe you add a new modular API, maybe you post a really rad piece of art to the forum. If people don't notice it at first, it won't get a lot of cred, but that's okay because cred is always being recomputed. And so if down the line, maybe 6 months later, people realize, whoa, your work really mattered, you will start to receive flows of cred as more and more contributions depend on or reference your work. Because it's retroactively updating, and because it's tied to the specific identity and the specific contribution, it's non-transferrable. In the same way that you can't transfer the cred for having written a great paper or authored a book, you can't transfer the cred for the contributions you've made. They're permanently tied to you as an individual. And finally, cred is wholly configurable. So this is the benefit of having a transparent, open source, and pluggable system. Every community can configure the system to reflect their own values, to reflect the kind of work that matters in that community, and to reflect their priorities. Now, a lot of you are probably thinking, is this really going to work? Because isn't the PageRank algorithm gameable? And if I were having this conversation with you in 2018, I would have said, well, you know, the PageRank could be gameable, but it's got these nice properties, it's Sybil resistant, so that will really mitigate a lot of these attacks. However, having spent the past 2 years working on a PageRank-based algorithm, I can say, yes, PageRank is hella gameable. But I think that's okay because all social systems are gameable. Whether you're looking at a social system of election, the social systems of getting promoted in a company, or even the social systems of being popular in a room, these things are gameable, you know? If you put on nice clothes, your social status will go up, even though you're the same person. So it's not so much that we need to stop gaming from existing at all, is that we need to become really good at managing it. And I think the key here is community moderation. If we were trying to make a single cred instance for the whole world, there's no way that it would be very difficult to come up with a set of rules that we could all agree on and a way to apply them. And without the ability to do that, the system would inevitably degenerate. But since cred is being used by specific communities, those communities can decide what kind of actions are okay. Maybe some communities will have a lot of trust and will be willing to run the algorithm in ways that could be easier to game, but provide a lot of useful signal because they trust each other a lot. Maybe other communities that are a lot larger, that maybe don't have as much social cohesion, will configure the algorithm so that there's more review needed to make modifications to the graph or to mint cred to a new part of it. Second, we can start to apply the lessons we've learned from computer security to making this algorithm secure. The way I think about it, gaming is sort of an incentive vulnerability. It's a point where you can take some actions that exploit the system and give you more reward than actually is appropriate. So maybe we can just use the same toolkit from computer security. We can start to have responsible disclosure and then actually reward people with bounties for disclosing clever ways to game the algorithm. We can start to just patch it and have the benefit of an open source system where anyone can add a new heuristic, anyone can add a new improvement, and in this way, the system gets more and more secure the more people are using it and the more eyes that are on it. And if you think about the world's most successful PageRank instance, which is to say Google Search, they're running an extremely opaque, extremely centralized algorithm where they will make unexplained changes to try to prevent gaming. If you think about this through the lens of computer security, they're going for security by obscurity. They're hoping that they'll prevent it from being gamed because nobody understands it well enough to keep up with them. But what we've learned from developing software is that open source software tends to be more secure. Security of obscurity doesn't work nearly as well as having everyone in the world be able to improve the security of the system. So this brings us to Grain. The first thing to know about cred, or the last thing to know about cred, is since it's not transferable, it's not a token, it's kind of an awkward fit for the rest of the ecosystem that we're developing on top of Ethereum. Because we're getting these really great tools for tokens. We've got ERC20s, we've got Uniswap. And so if our goal is to be able to flow economic value to open source contributors, we probably want a token that will affect those value flows. So that brings us to Grain. The first thing about Grain is that it's earned by contributors. If you're working in a project and you have a cred score in that project, then whenever the project issues new Grain, some of that Grain will come to you. And the way we're setting this up is so that the Grain flows are based on your lifetime cred, not just on your most recent cred. And what that means is you can get retroactive catch-ups. So I said how oftentimes your work might not initially be properly valued by cred because it hasn't been used yet. So we haven't been able to see how much value it will add. The cred will update retroactively. And when that happens, the Grain distributions will kind of catch you up. So the result is that if you're working on a project and you're getting compensated in Grain, you don't need to worry every week like, oh no, did I get enough cred? Like maybe they undervalued this work, I'm not gonna get paid for it. You can afford to say, hey, I know that my work is valuable. It might not be realized just yet because it's not finished, but in 6 months, in a year, when people start using it, my cred score will go up and I'll then kind of retroactively get all of the Grain that I'm owed for that work. Second, sponsors purchase Grain. So the idea is that we're going to create incentives for people who are stakeholders in the project to want to buy this Grain. And in the act of purchasing Grain, they are buying it from contributors, which means they are paying contributors for their work on the project. When you put these two pieces together, you realize that Grain is a proof of support. And it's a proof of support because the only ways you have Grain are either you supported the project by directly contributing to it, or you supported the project by buying Grain, which means you paid someone who directly contributed to it. Now, Grain has one key ability, which is that it gives you the ability to change cred. And this is called boosting. So a quick overview of the mechanics of boosting. Let's say that there's some contribution that you think is really important, or that you want people to pay more attention to. You can spend your Grain to boost that contribution. The boosted contribution will now be a source of new cred. Like its cred just intrinsically increases because somebody sent this costly signal of saying it was valuable. And then finally, the booster gets a slice of the future cred. This mechanism has some surprising implications. The first is that you can use boosting to influence the priorities of a project. Let's suppose that I have a feature that I really care about. It's blocking me from being able to use the project the way I want to. I don't need to go on GitHub issues and just kind of like beg and hope that somebody will, out of the pure kindness of their heart, decide to fix my bug for me. I can say, hey, I'm a stakeholder in this project. I'm going to buy some Grain and I'm going to boost that behind this feature that I need. And because that feature has now become worth more cred, that becomes an incentive for everyone else in the project to want to help me with my issue, not altruistically, but rationally. Second, it creates a sort of cred prediction market. Because the other thing about boosting is that once you've boosted something, you're in line to receive a share of the cred that it gets in the future. So let's suppose, for example, that I'm in a project that's just really undervaluing design work. Their project is not getting much use because the UIs are just poorly designed. Nobody is like working on it. They don't have a full-time designer. I could go and say, hey, I'm going to boost all the design work in this project. I'm going to start making there be more cred for designers. And as a result, I'm going to be a stakeholder in all the future cred that's going to come to design. So if I'm right, and my boosting of the design work leads to a more successful project, then I'm going to receive a lot of cred because I'm now contributing not through my direct labor, but I'm contributing by coordinating the work of other people in the project. I'm contributing by setting priorities and making good choices. And this means that boosting defines a protocol for decentralized management. If you think about a standard corporation, one of the main roles of managers is to allocate resources. They're given budget, they're given headcount, and they have to try to deploy that in a way that will generate returns. But it's centralized and permissioned. You can't show up to Google one day and say, hey, I want to deploy some resources towards making the Google Slides user interface better. Because Google will say, sorry, I don't really care about your ideas. You're not part of us, you know? But with boosting, anyone could say, hey, I have conviction. I think this project doesn't have the right priorities. I'm going to help fund the development of those priorities, and I'm going to be a stakeholder in the project if I've made good choices. So it's all well and good to define these kinds of novel cryptoeconomic systems. And it's really seductive to design something in your head and think, this will be so cool. We'll all be living in like Accelerando or a Neil Stephenson novel. But the problem is that reality is really messy and just contains so many more variables and interactions than we can ever anticipate. And for that reason, it's really important to actually dog food stuff like this. And that's what we've been doing for the past 6 months. We're calling it the cred-experiment. We turned it on a little bit after Berlin Blockchain Week. And the idea is that before we have anyone else using SourceCred, we want to make sure that it actually works in the ideal test case of SourceCred itself. So we've been importing data from both GitHub, where we've got 7 repositories. We wind up having about 20,000 nodes in our graph. And the result is that every single issue, for example, has a cred score. This issue to refactor, so we run PageRank on the back end, got 210 cred. And this issue about making SourceCred more robust on really big repositories earned 106 cred. We've also integrated with our discourse, with our forums. And we actually very intentionally held off on starting the cred-experiment until we had a discourse plugin. The reason for that is that we think it's really important that healthy open source communities be inclusive and be recognizing lots of different kinds of labor. The work of coding, the work of writing and reviewing pull requests, filing issues is only one piece of the puzzle of making a healthy project and a healthy community. And so if you look at our discourse cred, you get very different kinds of things earning cred. The highest cred post ever was written by Bino, who's sitting over there. And it's about champions and heroes. It's an exploration of what it looks like for someone to really be a champion in an open source community and take responsibility for seeing things through to completion. Another post that earned a lot of cred by LB, also sitting in the front row, is the Dark Star SourceCred art. And so LB is a very talented artist and designer. They made the background images for these slides, for example. And they've started posting their art to the discourse. And this is the Dark Star piece. So the result is that there's now even art cred. You can earn cred for any kind of work. We're going to have a lot of logistics cred minted this week because it's a lot of logistical work to set up these presentations. So this is bringing me near the end of the talk. I'll talk a bit about our roadmap. Some pieces are done. We're able to compute cred. We're able to issue grain. And the cred computation works across GitHub and Discourse at the moment. We're working on adding a Discord implementation. And we're reaching the point where there are enough plugins that if you had a particular data source you needed to incorporate, it wouldn't be too hard. We have yet to implement boosting. That's probably the thing I'm most excited about because it will really prove that the whole cryptoeconomic model can work. Sometime after we've started dogfooding boosting, we're going to build the ERC20 token integration. Right now, cred and grain are all off-chain. We're just kind of experimentally prototyping them. And we're going to progressively decentralize the technology as we become confident that we're building on the right foundation. And in the far future, but also in some ways the most exciting, we're going to start learning how to create meta instances of cred and grain. So this is where we come back to rewarding whole ecosystems. What if you have a project like SourceCred that depends on other open source projects like Discourse and Node.js and Python? Well, we think that we can create these meta cred instances where every node in the graph is itself a project, and then we can start to really flow value across the entire open source dependency tree. If you'd like to get involved, I'd love to have you as a contributor. You can come say hello on our Discord, and there's an intro channel, and you can just say hi. You can also check out, if you go to sourcecred.io, you can also find our GitHub and our forums. If you'd like to sponsor SourceCred, we're currently doing it all in the fiat world of Open Collective, and we'll eventually find a way to give you the grain so you can start boosting stuff in the project. And we're also later this year going to set up some proper DeFi funding infrastructure as well. And finally, we're just at the point now where we're ready to start having beta users. Because we have used SourceCred successfully for about half a year on ourselves and have distributed a lot of value in the form of grain through it, we just have enough confidence that this is not going to blow up in people's faces. So it's nice to get a couple communities using it. We're looking primarily for kind of small, highly aligned crypto communities that are really interested in this root problem of being able to distribute tokens well. You can read about this on our forums at this link. Just if you search for beta pilot, you'll find it. And we encourage you to post there if you're interested in participating. And that's my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm happy to take some questions.
So, Dandelion, with the boosting mechanism, what happens with the grain token after, I guess?
Right. So the key thing with boosting is that I think that you want to have a way for tokens. Tokens are entering the system through minting to contributors. And so you want a way for tokens to also exit the system. The idea with boosting is that it does either destroy or burn or permanently stake, take your pick. But it permanently locks up the grain that's used to boost.
Okay.
We could imagine this mechanism. If you're someone who's finds this really exciting and likes thinking about cryptoeconomics, we'd love to talk to you because there's a lot of different related ideas here. We're also thinking we might set up boosting curves that would allow you to kind of move grain in and out, but with some amount that gets burned as you move in and out of the boosting curve.
Right. Okay. Very cool. And then. Another question with a retroactive kind of seeking what contributions people are making. Do you see there being a significant amount of compute power that's being put into, or a significant cost for the network to continue going back in time to fetch data?
So when I say retroactive cred, what I mostly mean is that work that you did last year could earn a lot of new cred this year, if it's being more dependent on.
Right.
I will say that computationally speaking, running PageRank on these massive graphs across time sampling is fairly expensive.
Okay.
So for the time being, this doesn't run on chain. It's all done locally.
Right.
But it's pretty easy to verify the correctness of a cred distribution. Okay. So we can imagine ways to do verification on chain later as the system becomes more mature.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hey, Dandelion, thank you for an awesome presentation. Always excited to hear about what you guys are up to in SourceCred. My question is about the possibility of fungibility of cred across different projects in the future. Now, I know you said in the beginning of the presentation, each project is self-contained, which makes sense. Do you think that might ever be a possibility? And I think an interesting model here is kind of like the way Stack Overflow, Stack Exchange does it, where it's not that reputation points earned on one forum go one for one on another forum. But if you've passed a certain threshold on one forum, then maybe when you sign up for another one, you start with a base level that gives you some permissions that you wouldn't have somewhere else. Any thoughts around that?
Right. I think this comes back to the idea of these meta cred instances. So I think you could imagine, for example, having a meta cred instance across the Ethereum ecosystem, and then having a lot of cred in specific Ethereum projects would be partly carrying over to cred in the whole ecosystem. And I think that's very similar to how reputation works in the real world, which is a nice sign.
Thank you.
Thanks. This is really fascinating. I wanted to first of all understand one technical thing. So you said trying to catch up with lifetime cred. Are you basically saying that you, in a given update, you might end up noticing that there was some really pivotal thing that is suddenly worth a lot of cred, and so all the recent contributions go to this one person in order to build up, so that at that point in time you try to maximize the overall lifetime balance of all credit ever given?
That's exactly right. So when we do the grain distribution, what we're trying to do is bring everyone as close to fair if the cred had always been exactly as it is today. So some people who might have been overcompensated relative to their current cred will get only small distributions.
So you don't take it away, but
yeah, it never gets taken away.
More. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Really fascinating stuff. I like it. Thanks.
Yep. What up, fam? So I just thought I might give some insight as like a person who did try and utilize SourceCred for just some exploratory experiments on distribution of tokens for really anything. And something that I've experienced over the last few years doing different tokens has been like people try and do one distribution method to kickstart their entire like project, community, protocol. And what I actually found was that one, utilizing distribution across a bunch of different mediums, so whether it's going after like validators with merge mining or airdrops for like community and social media, all that stuff's really good. But what I found SourceCred useful for in its like earliest stages, like I think you showed it to me in summertime over like back in Berlin, was just trying to see the actual contribution to repos across even the blockchain space alone, and mimicking some of the stuff I'd seen from Handshake when they used GitHub repos as like a community resource to drop tokens to and see who would claim them and come from maybe Web 2 into Web 3 or from Web 3 projects and go into like the Handshake universe, right? And so as you guys have been building out SourceCred as a distribution for tokens like tool outside of everything else, is there been any like new insights that you've seen on whether because I really like how you can like weight comments, and now that you've done the Discord implementation, that's kind of popping off in my head all the different ways that you could approach dropping tokens to projects that you really identify with, kind of line up with your own ethos, and you can go at it from a lot of different perspectives. So I just kind of wanted to hear if any of this Discord API integration had brought out new insights into where you're seeing the token generation or the token distribution.
Well, I would say that in general, a lot of people have been very interested in using SourceCred on just kind of like an en masse kind of way of inspecting other projects.
Yeah.
From my perspective, that's kind of fragile because SourceCred really is a social algorithm, and that means it needs engagement from the community to stay aligned. I think SourceCred on a project that's never been incentivized via SourceCred, it will work pretty well out of the box because there isn't gaming in the underlying signal.
Yeah.
If you were to use SourceCred sort of in like a telescopic way on other projects, once they started to adapt to the fact that they were being scanned with cred, either they need to engage to keep the system in alignment, or it will become more and more gamed and divergent.
Yeah.
So that's why personally I haven't really focused very much on running SourceCred on like third-party repositories. It's really about finding communities that want to adopt it themselves.
Yep. Okay. Well, that's cool.